Greetings and welcome back to Church in the World. This is part 2 of our three-parter on peace in the fourth week of this series in the season of Easter, where we're looking at the ELCA's social statements. Today we're looking at for God's peace in the world, I think it is, the peace statement of the social statement on peace from the ELCA. This is from the year 1995. In this second video, we're going to talk about how our faith is active for peace in the world. We're going to talk about biblical insights for peace. We're going to talk about integration and particularity, which are two forces that work both for and against peace at different times. We're going to talk about being citizens of the USA and our political responsibilities as citizens of the United States of America for those who are. And we're going to talk about positions of Christians regarding war. It's a lot to cover, and believe it or not, we're still only going to be halfway through the social statement when we finish, so let's get started. So, we have a faith that is active for peace in the world. We trust in God's promise of final peace, freely given in Jesus Christ alone, which drives us. Through the cross of Christ, God calls us to serve the needs of our neighbor, and our everyday communities form the arena where faith acts in love for peace. So this is everything you do all day long, right? This is your vocatio, your vocations, your calls. God calls us to be peacemakers in all arenas of our lives. Our homes, our friendships, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our congregations, our volunteer associations, our towns, our cities, our nations, our international communities, and as citizens, we are to seek to influence our nation's actions for peace among the nation. Notice that. Sharing a common humanity with all people, we are called to work for peace throughout the globe. That means, right, that while we may talk about the ways in which we work for peace, whether or not we are working for peace between all nations and all peoples is not negotiable. That is part of it, what it is to follow Jesus Christ. And our amenity communities, they mutually influence one another, right? Your home life influences your professional life, influences your life as a member of a congregation, etc., right? It just goes through that. And war can disrupt and devastate family life, for example. Efforts to create just and secure communities within our nation go hand in hand with the pursuit of peace among all nations. Because Christians act for peace in varied settings, our responsibilities, experiences, interests, and perspectives will differ. We often disagree on how to build earthly peace, but biblical insight provides common context for discerning direction. So here we are, biblical insights into peace. We affirm that earthly peace is built on the recognition of the unity and goodness of all created existence, the oneness of humanity, and the dignity of every person. Peace is difference in unity. It requires both respect for the uniqueness of others, finite persons in particular communities, and acknowledgement of common humanity, right? So, first and foremost, the unity of all created things. This is not a zero-sum game. My good is not good if it comes at your ill, right? So that's not peace, and that's not what God calls us to. That's a biblical insight. Now, because all are sinners before God, efforts to build earthly peace, that is, peace outside of the kingdom of God, outside of the eschaton and the coming of Christ and the resurrection, earthly peace must recognize sin's persistent and pervasive and subtle power. We easily deceive ourselves about our own righteousness. Even our best intentions can produce harmful results, right? Our efforts must take account of the human tendency to dominate and destroy, and must recognize those principalities and powers that cause strife in our world. We advocate an earthly peace that provides security from violence and aggression, seeks just order in place of tyranny or anarchy, checks unrestrained power, and defends and enhances the life of people who are poor and powerless. Notice that civil order here is specifically oriented towards helping those who are least powerful and least privileged, right? The poor and the powerless are the people that civil order, that justice is most needed for, even in terms of earthly peace. So the government is accountable for that, right? Whatever the government is, however it's structured, that's its purpose. It is to always work for the least powerful people, not the most vocal people. And that's really important and something we need to keep in mind. See, in spite of human enmity, God continues to work through people, their communities, and their structures to make earthly peace possible. This is a basic Lutheran tenet we talked about in church and society. God works through means. God has not just decided to throw us to the wolves and God will magic it all away one day. No, God works through us. God's work our hands, as the ELCA likes to say in its motto. Or is it our mission statement? Who knows? But that's kind of the slogan, the tag that we have, because we believe God does work through people to create justice, to build safety, to build security, to make peace, right? Building earthly peace encompasses all the dimensions of human society because we are whole human beings on our own. And these dimensions include the patterns of beliefs and values that give meaning to life, like culture, including religion, and the structures and practices that sustain life, like economics, and the structures and processes that allow communities to make and enforce decisions, politics. We believe God works through human culture, economics, and politics, and intends them to restrain evil and promote the common good, right? That is the good for all. Earthly peace is not the same as the promised peace of God's present and future eternal reign. As a human achievement built in the middle of strife, earthly peace is often fleeting and always partial. It is difficult to build and maintain. It is easily and frequently disrupted by violence and war. All the more, then, is earthly peace a most precious gift. It embodies God's intention for creation, serves human and planetary good, and gives space to proclaim the gospel, keeping hope in God alive. So, in short, when we talk about earthly peace, our biblical insight is what it looks like, which is the seeking of justice, the working of powers and policies, and constant human efforts to make earthly peace possible, especially nonviolent responses to violence, seeking of justice for the poor and the powerless, especially recognition of the oneness of humanity and the falseness of the sin that convinces us that we are separate people who have separate goods, right? No, there's only one good for creation and for humanity, and it's all the same good, okay? So what then? Then we have to talk about how this is all lived in our time, right? Integration and particularity are two dynamics that are really important, and the statement defines these very quickly. Integration is, let's see here. Integration is the increasing integration. It's sometimes called globalism, the increasing movement towards greater integration, which affects the world's diverse communities, right? It accentuates the attention people give to their particular communities. Familiar religious, cultural, ethnic, and national communities continue to be decisive sources for people's sense of belonging, outlook, and perception of their interests. Versus particularity, which is the that's particularity, and integration would be the global market, right? The increasing interconnectedness of the world. Now, in 1995, we couldn't imagine how interconnected the world was going to get, right? We didn't have the internet in common, homes, and we certainly didn't have these smartphone devices, right? So these are the dynamics. Then they shape today's quest for peace. Integration promises broader global community. Particularity promises deeper personal community. Integration threatens to bring inequality and domination by unaccountable powers. Particularity threatens to bring fragmentation and violent conflict by groups that deny the humanity of those who differ from them. Recognizing both promise and threat, we seek an earthly peace that affirms unity in our diversity, right? So these two states, right, these two forces, this increasing interconnectedness and this desire or recognition of our particularity, are actually false, right? The notion that we're becoming more integrated is not true. We're becoming more aware of our integration. The globe has always been a globe, right? The weather system has always been the weather system, right? Human societies have always interchanged ideas. We just weren't always aware of it, and it's become faster because our communications are faster, but we've always been integrated. In the same way, we've always been particular, I have always been who I am, but I may become more aware of my particularity, especially when I'm encountering persons who are starkly different from me in many ways, and that can harden my particular boundary. But what we seek is to recognize and celebrate particularity in the midst of our integrated diversity, right? And this becomes problematic because of the impact of states. States, the statement says, vastly unequal in their power, exercise their sovereignty in a thickening web of international organizations and agreements, regionally and globally. And economic integration diminishes governments' ability to determine their own economic policies. National borders are ever more permeable by outside influences. The movement of people across borders due to war or poverty is massive and controversial. Moreover, numerous states face disintegration from within when minority groups, usually ethnic communities, seek their own state or autonomy. In vicious civil wars, civilians are often targeted by armed groups. Such wars raise new questions about what, if anything, the international community can and should do in the face of internal conflicts, right? So we've got all these forces, right, and all these circumstances that we're negotiating as we move towards peace. So what is our political responsibility? What is our responsibility in terms of making decisions? Well, first, we want to talk about being the citizens. We have to recognize the responsibility political leaders, policymakers, and diplomats have for peace in this time. This is a democracy or a democratic republic or a representative republic, however you want to frame it, or constitutional democracy. However you want to call our system of government, it is functionally one in which every person who is citizen has a participation in the government. We all help make these decisions. And so we all share this awesome responsibility for seeking peace in this time. And so the church encourages participation by Christians in the affairs of government. Our faith as Christians gives distinctive quality to our life as citizens. Love, born of faith, calls us not to harm others and to help them in every need. Very basic stuff. So we look at the scriptures for direction. We also look at political guidance. For that, we look upon reason, we look at compassion, we examine and draw upon human experience through which we believe God is at work in creating and preserving the world. For the welfare of our neighbors, we, in company with others, press for what is right and good within the limits and possibilities of the actual situation. And this is actually really important about how Lutherans think about ethics. We don't say, well, war always harms, therefore war always bad, right? It's just not that simple, right? We have to look at our options as they actually exist within an actual situation. It's why we can't just make a blanket statement about war or peace that covers every possible situation. We instead have to make decisions among many competing goods and interests, and all of them cannot be realized. So, very important. Political authority always relies on the consent of the people and the threat and use of coercion. There simply isn't political authority in human communities without coercion, as far as most people understand it. There are certainly some persons who I know would disagree with that, depending on their particular political philosophies, but generally speaking, most governments have some form of coercion. And Lutherans affirm that government may legitimately employ such measures as law and its enforcement, police protection, provisions for the common defense, and resistance to aggression, right? So governments can do these things, right? We're not saying you can't have any sort of police force, right? We're not saying you can't have any sort of law enforcement. We're not saying you can't have any sort of military. But we also affirm that governments should vigorously pursue less coercive measures over more coercive ones. Consent over compulsion, nonviolence over violence, diplomacy over military engagement, and deterrence over war. So already, even though we've said sometimes you just don't have options, as a systemic effort, all governments should always be pursuing the least coercive measure, the least violent measure, consent instead of compulsion, nonviolence instead of violence, diplomacy over military, deterrence over war, right? The United States plays a vital role in determining whether or not this can work in world affairs, and it cannot or should not withdraw or isolate itself from the rest of the world. Neither should it seek to control or police the whole world. Global challenges cannot be addressed just by the United States, but few can be met without the United States' participation. This is contrary to this kind of America First policy proposal that we've heard recently. No, you can't have America first, right? Global policy and global politics will affect America. To withdraw as the United States from that arena is not helpful because we have influence whether we like it or not, and withdrawing our influence doesn't actually help. In fact, it hampers a lot of efforts. All nations have an obligation, of course, to respect the interests of other states and international actors, and to comply with international law, something we should note as a nation that has committed war crimes in my lifetime more than once under multiple administrations. Surprise. As a nation that tortures people, which we do, or at least certainly have, something we should think about. Nations should seek their own common good in the context of the global common good. International bodies should work for the welfare of all nations. Citizens need to give careful attention to how we in the United States perceive our national interest and interpret our national identity, since what states do depends in large measure on their views of their own interests and identity. Sin's power often makes itself felt in arrogant and self-righteous views of national identity and in narrow short-term and absolute views of national interest, right? We call for an imaginative attention to the interests and welfare of other nations, especially those that are viewed as enemies or that are considered unimportant for our nation's interests. For the sake of a greater good, or for reasons of conscience, citizens may need to oppose a prevailing understanding or practice of national identity and interest. This is something Christians have been doing recently. Citizens may even need to resist oppressive government in order to work for peace. And then there's the question of war in general. Wars, first of all, represent a horrendous failure of politics. If war has happened, it's because politics has failed. We lament that the Church has blessed crusades and wars in the name of Jesus Christ, and we recognize with sorrow too often people formed in the Lutheran tradition have passively accepted their government's call to arms or have too readily endorsed war to resolve conflicts. First and foremost, love of neighbor obligates us to act to prevent wars and to seek alternatives to them, especially in view of modern weapons and their proliferation. For this reason, we are focusing on building a just peace. We identify tasks that create conditions for peace. Yet wars and their threats still thrust themselves upon us, and we cannot avoid making decisions about them. And so we face conflicting moral claims and agonizing dilemmas, right? And this is where the statement gets into basically the ways in which Christians have talked about this just war versus what's commonly called pacifism, which I think is better called just peacemaking, right? Also known as conscientious objection sometimes. Some people would say just peacemaking is actually a third way. It's a very complicated issue. But very briefly, there are Christians who say that there are principles in this so-called just and unjust war tradition, right? And these principles seek to limit occasions of war by setting forth conditions that must be met to render military action justifiable. Beginning with a strong presumption against all war, support for and participation in a war to restore peace is a tragic contestant to a sinful war in this case. And the principles for deciding about wars include right intention, justifiable cause, legitimate authority, last resort, have we exhausted all the possibilities, declaration of war aims, proportionality, reasonable chances of success in the war. The principles for conducting war include non-combatant immunity and proportionality. By the way, by these rubrics, the United States has not engaged in a just war since at latest World War II. Every other war or armed conflict we've been in since then does not meet this test. Have fun with that. The principles for conducting war include non-combatant immunity and proportionality. The United States has definitely not done that. The principles for post-war conduct include showing mercy to the defeated and assisting them to rebuild. It's debatable whether or not we've done that. Justifiable national and international commitment of forces to armed conflicts depend on adherence to these principles. So, good job, United States citizens. We haven't done that in the last 50 or so years. So we need to remember that. And that, by the way, is the one that's more conducive to current political discussion, right? Then we have to talk about conscientious objection, right? From the posture, remember, though, just unjust war tradition, even in that tradition, the aim of politics is peace. Any political activity that involves coercion should be held accountable to just unjust war principles, period. They are important for evaluating movements, sanctions, embargoes, boycotts, trade policies to reward or punish, and other coercive but nonviolent measures. Now, the Church and others fail often to teach and apply these principles, which can and have been misused in self-serving ways. So, we have to be humble and self-critical and engage in further deliberation about this tradition. But there's the other tradition, right? And today the Church needs the witness of its members who in the name of Jesus Christ refuse all participation in war, who commit themselves to establish peace and justice on earth by nonviolent power alone, and who may suffer and die in their discipleship. We support those who conscientiously object to bearing arms in military service. We must continue the perennial discussion in the Church Universal about whether Christian love and discipleship prohibit participation in war in all circumstances, or whether they may permit it in some circumstances. This discussion poses important and difficult biblical, historical, theological, and ethical questions, right? Even Christians may differ on these questions, but there's still a basis for practical cooperation on their common presumption against violence and commitment to peace. No matter what people decide, they remain under God's judgment and in need of God's mercy given in the cross of Christ. What does this mean? It's a lot of verbiage. Here we go. There is no such thing as a sinless war. There is no such thing as a war that is justly engaged in without it being the literal last resort, having a decent chance of success, being waged to protect the innocent and prevent greater evil or greater harm, right? Being engaged in under certain circumstances where the innocent and non-combatants are immune from the effects of direct violence from the war. All of these things are things we haven't done as a nation for a very long time, if ever. And so it's important for us to recognize that the just war tradition, which is the one that's most able to endorse government war in Christian thought, is not very permissive at all. Let's be clear here. I'm not very sympathetic to just war because I don't know of many nations that have ever actually adhered to it. I think it's an impractical philosophy because it's a set of rules that we shift as circumstances permit to justify the state and what it wants to do for its own interests. Just wars by design benefit everybody more than inaction would. That's what they would have to do. And by everybody, we include the enemy, right? We include the one against whom we declare war. It's real high bar to clear. But we have to remember that the alternative is not sitting at home and not being involved. Right? Christians do not have an option for what's called quietism, where we just don't talk about it and don't engage. No, we are active, always for peace. Just peacemaking is often called this term, and it's where we don't sit back and just let wars happen and say, oh, that's really a shame that you guys are doing that. We engage in the discourse and we engage with activity to help those who are affected by war, alleviate symptoms of war, and work and advocate constantly to end war. That is a very different strand of the Christian tradition. Both of these are understandable. Both have some legacy within the Lutheran tradition and within the Western Church generally. And it's something to remember that we live in a highly militarized time, right? Our police sometimes have tanks. We live in a highly violent time in a lot of ways. We've talked already about the death penalty. We'll talk about criminal justice. Here we're talking about peace, but think about how we try to make peace and how often that involves a gun or a bomb or a drone or somebody starving and dying because of an embargo. We have to struggle with this as citizens and as people of faith in our country or in any country. That's going to take some hard doing. So what then do we do? What do we do to keep, make, and build international peace today? That is our topic next time, and I hope you'll join me. Until then, God bless.